Imagine being one of the leading toy companies at the dawn of the 1980s. You find yourself with a pedigree that includes the leading girls branded doll ever made, a seemingly limitless range of small, desirable die-cast cars, and a revolving door of movie or television franchises to help keep your company financially successful. Eventually, you hit your stride in the male-dominated action figure genre. The brand you present skyrockets, finding itself at or at least very near the top and competing in the same league as other boys' targeted lines at the time. But before we reach the summit of this mountain, we need to look back at the development of the line that would eventually become known as Masters of the Universe. There will be missed opportunities, impending lawsuits, and even an 11th hour name change, all occurring before the first coat of paint was applied at the factory, producing our favorite sword and sorcery themed figures. And thus, the story of the most powerful man in the universe, his supporting cast of masters, and the evil forces they did battle with begins right now.
As with many businesses, the inception of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe came from a company's willingness to compete for the attention of young, imaginative minds who were browsing the toy aisles for the latest and greatest action figure to buy. But this story isn't without some initial stumbling blocks. In 1976, Mattel CEO Ray Wagner had the first right of refusal to license and produce Star Wars action figures based on what was then an unknown but forthcoming movie. Not feeling the licensing fee was worth it, and clearly not seeing the potential that hindsight would bring years later, Ray and Mattel as a company declined the opportunity, and this would be a choice that would have a seismic impact on the toy industry.
Of course, for the late 1970s through to the early part of the 1980s, Mattel would go into something of an experimentation mode in trying to match the success of Star Wars. Yes, they had a pair of powerhouse brands in Barbie as well as Hot Wheels, but those catered to different audiences, and Mattel knew that there was vast potential in having an action figure range complemented by vehicles, creatures, and playsets. And while there is some niche-level collectability today for lines such as Flash Gordon, Battlestar Galactica, and Clash of the Titans, the missed opportunity in losing out on Star Wars made Mattel's potential dominance of the action figure market feel like a galaxy far, far away, if you catch my drift. Yes, Mattel did initially try their hand at the Conan license. However, realizing it was an R-rated film and thus finding themselves with difficulty marketing such a toy line to children, Mattel instead opted to develop what would become the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe action figure line, which they debuted at Toy Fair in 1982. Development of this would forego what was then considered a common practice in licensing a toy line from an existing franchise, rather than developing a unique in-house brand. Feeling that the barbarian-themed He-Man was developed in bad faith, Conan Properties Inc. would eventually pursue a lawsuit against Mattel, a legal battle that would last between the two sides through the 1980s. However, over these years, the lawsuit would be unsuccessful in proving that He-Man was any form of copyright or trademark infringement to Conan.
In reality, He-Man was being developed independently behind the scenes, with Mattel realizing the potential of a barbarian-themed character befitting the sword and sorcery genre. Behind closed doors, presentation to senior management was spearheaded by several individuals, and through the brilliance of designer Roger Sweet, 3 potential concepts to launch a toy line were presented with the hopes of competing with the aforementioned Star Wars range of figures and playsets. This process would include Roger using an existing Big Jim action figure and some sculpting clay to present as follows: the military-themed figure with a tank-like head, the sci-fi figure with a bullet-shaped head reminding us of Boba Fett, and a barbarian figure that would represent an early rendition of the character we'd come to know as He-Man.
Of course, this latter figure would represent the concept for which Mattel would build its new toy line around. Roger's idea was to proportion the figure with so much muscle that it became several times the weight of even the most muscular-looking bodybuilders in the world at the time. Furthermore, the plan here was to also make sure that this toy would stand out amongst other concurrent toy lines it would compete against, and to literally dwarf them in stature when kids would haul them out to play with. There would also be other inputs into what would become the Masters of the Universe franchise, through the added design and/or marketing expertise of names such as Mark Taylor, Mark Ellis, Paul Cleveland, Ted Mayer, Tony Guerrero, and Derek Gable, among many others. The initial prototype Barbarian figure would evolve into the blonde, loincloth-wearing He-Man character whose recognizability and iconic status is immeasurable even to this day. Fleshing out the range of characters involved multiple iterations, evolving from early concepts through to implementation, and the talents of designers such as Mark Taylor were utilized to their fullest potential to give us a toy line we can be proud to collect even decades later. Now taking place in the world of Eternia, this range of toys would be developed to incorporate an incredibly broad lineup of characters. The 1982 set would consist of 8 key figures, as well as a few vehicles, He-Man's faithful riding mount, and of course the most iconic playset in Masters of the Universe history, and arguably toy history as a whole. Kids at this age wanted the power to do their own things and make their own choices, hence the tagline in the cartoon whenever Prince Adam would hold up his sword to become the most powerful man in the universe. This would of course affect play patterns for the toys we would get, as the line would be centered around He-Man himself. The pop culture climate of the 1980s was perfect for this sort of line to come out. Films like the boxing-based Rocky III and otherworldly blockbusters like E.T. as well as Tron would do much to pique the interests of children and adults alike. Wonderful hit songs would also become timeless and worthy of repeat airplay to remind us of this amazing 1982 year. And of course, the small screen would give us many icons of pop culture to watch in between our playtime battlefield adventures between He-Man and Skeletor on Eternia.
Now, with everything set for launch, a few late changes and additions were made. At a presentation with one of the large toy stores, and in hopes of the store carrying this new toy line, Mark Ellis, who handled marketing for Mattel, would sporadically come up with the idea for a mini comic to be packed in with each figure. This was to help tell the story at hand. With all of this in place, the working title of the line was actually to be called Lords of Power. However, senior management's feeling was that this had too much of a religious context, and thus the name, Masters of the Universe, was decided upon at the 11th hour. While developers of the line were not too thrilled with the name at the time, it certainly had the staying power that just rolls off the tongue when you say it, even today.
All of that brings us back to the aforementioned first wave of figures that would springboard Mattel's success in the action figure market for the years to come. This opening year was split into 2 separately timed releases, with the first half of the figures being released earlier in 1982 than the second half. And within that first half, we can most certainly start with the most powerful man in the universe. This was the figure that was jointly conceptualized and brought to life by the efforts of individuals like Roger Sweet and Mark Taylor. With a 5.5-inch height and a gigantic muscular build, He-Man towered over the other heroes that kids were meant to buy at the time. He even came with a twisting power punch feature that would become a staple of many of these vintage figures. As the main character of the franchise, he was armed with a battle axe, a shield, and a sword, the latter of which would be popularized with Lou Scheimer's Filmation cartoon that would air the following year. The mini-comic portrayed He-Man as a more savage individual, being a wandering barbarian of the jungle and earning the right to wield his weapons from the sorceress in these earliest stories. The addition of Prince Adam was a more gentle alter ego that would not come until later on, the execution of which was also made popular with the Filmation cartoon. All in all, this is the character that the entire franchise is centered around, and often the first character fans think of when they are looking to build their Masters of the Universe collection. Whether this vintage incarnation is your figure of choice, or if you choose more modern releases, your adventures on Eternia will most certainly involve He-Man as the key hero in your stories.
Side by side with He-Man on the field of battle is Man-at-Arms. Going by the real name of Duncan, Man-at-Arms serves as a senior advisor to the ruling family of Eternia, and also plays the role of a weapons master who can train others in the art of combat. often portrayed as the adoptive father of Teela, who we'll get to shortly. Man-at-Arms is looked at as the right-hand man of He-Man when they go off on adventures together. The figure does come with various pieces of armor, including one on his arm, his leg, and across his chest. Also equipped with a club-like weapon, this vintage portrayal is clean-shaven and doesn't sport the signature mustache that would become synonymous with the character in the years to follow. In many ways, Man-at-Arms is the first character you think of when establishing He-Man's supporting entourage of masters.
Standing immediately opposite the He-Man and Man-at-Arms on the battlefield would be Skeletor. As told during a Toys That Made Us Season 1 episode from 2017, Skeletor was created by Mark Taylor. In fact, the idea for Skeletor came from Taylor's own terrifying experience when he was just a child and saw an actual skeleton during a visit to a haunted attraction at an amusement park. Having evolved through some concept sketches while always maintaining something of a deathly appearance, an early idea was to call the character D-Man, which is a play on the word demon. Do take note that while he comes with his famous Havoc staff, he also came with his own sword, which is cut in a way that appears as only a half sword when you look at its back side. Combining it with He-Man's half of the sword, the idea was that whoever possesses both halves would be able to unlock Castle Grayskull and its secrets, which we'll discuss later on when we get to that playset. Skeletor is every bit as iconic as many of the great villains of this era, very much on equal footing as Darth Vader, Cobra Commander, and Megatron. Some forms of fiction depict him as King Randor's brother, which would make him the uncle of He-Man. His maniacal laugh was made famous by voice actor Alan Oppenheimer in the Filmation cartoon series. Now, while many collections will start with a He-Man figure, most fans will tell you that Skeletor is just as important of a character to own.
Rounding out the initial first half of Wave 1 is Beast Man, a furry creature of sorts. He is often seen by Skeletor's side as one of his main henchmen. He comes with a harness and armor much like other figures in the range, and a whip for his hand that was actually an item reused from Mattel's aforementioned Big Jim line previously. It should be noted that one of Mark Taylor's original designs for Beastman was said to look too similar to the Star Wars Wookiee Chewbacca. As such, Beastman was reworked into the appearance that fans are familiar and love today.
We will also point out here that there does exist a whole slew of variants with the figures we're discussing. For example, depending on whether or not you own an earlier or later release, the color of He-Man's belt can vary between production runs. Skeletor's boots also have paint variants, what with having a half boot and full boot appearance. And the color details on Man-at-Arms' helmet can also vary depending on the version that you own. These are but a few out of many instances of variations that occurred across this line of toys. As 1982 rolled on, we then get the second half of this opening assortment of figures. Merman, the ocean warlord, could operate independently, but also served as a henchman to Skeletor when he was just hanging out with the evil forces at Snake Mountain. He was originally going to be called Seaman, but thankfully they changed that name. Some early art and prototypes had more detail on Merman, particularly on his legs, but this did not make it into final production. Another interesting fact is that he was initially proposed to be a heroic character, but was changed to be among the villains instead.
Moving along, here's a character that helped make Masters of the Universe a popular line even to young girls at the time. This is Teela. She comes on a completely different body than the male figures for obvious reasons. Initially advertised as a warrior goddess, she was later reworked into a captain of the palace guard, serving the royal family of Eternia, most notably in the Filmation cartoon series. The figure itself comes with a snake staff, a shield, and a snake-like headdress accessory. That said, for the purposes of media appearances, Teela is more often than not shown without this headdress. Known as the adoptive daughter of Man-at-Arms, she is also the biological daughter of the sorceress in most forms of media. She's also often portrayed as a love interest of He-Man.
Stratos represents the last of the heroic characters in this initial 1982 year. The leader of a bird race from a civilization known as Avion, this winged warrior helps He-Man from the skies. He did come in multiple versions, including that with a blue backpack and red wings, and others with this color scheme reversed to be a red backpack with blue wings. Overall, he is one of He-Man's most trusted allies and seems to do fine in battle even without a handheld weapon like the rest of the characters in this wave. We then come to the most unique character in this particular first year range. Rounding out this initial wave of figures is the cosmic enforcer known as Zodac. He was a neutral character, something that's always been uncommon in a toy line, and even more so going back to 1982 when selling toys was largely based on the good versus evil archetype. Generally, he's advertised as a watcher, someone who oversees conflict and maintains balance between the two sides. That said, due to his interactions with the good guys in the cartoon that would begin the following year, one would be led to believe that he's more heroic than neutral, even if this isn't entirely true. Zodac was introduced into the first wave of figures when Mattel's management didn't think that there was enough interest for a second figure to be sold adjacent to Teela, hence the introduction of our now famous neutral cosmic enforcer. The figure has a very unique head sculpt and carries a blaster of sorts. Story-wise, we should also add that Zodac is a much older character than the rest of our 1982 cast, being amongst the Council of Elders from an earlier period of Eternian history.
Another centerpiece character in the Masters of the Universe lore is Battle Cat, the faithful, oversized tiger mount of He-Man. Few things in toy-related pop culture are as iconic, let alone more iconic, than He-Man riding Battle Cat. A true scaredy cat named Cringer by day, and the brave, ferocious Battle Cat by night, this armored feline was actually the result of, if you can believe, a lack of budget on Mattel's part. Without the funds needed for another vehicle to introduce into this opening lineup of toys, someone at Mattel had to improvise. As such, it was marketing executive Paul Cleveland who decided to utilize existing tooling from Mattel's Big Jim line of years past. Actually meant to be scaled for the larger Big Jim figures, Paul suggested to put a saddle on the tiger, thus making it more believable to see our favorite muscle-bound barbarian riding this creature into battle. The tiger was changed from its more traditional colors to one of green with orange stripes, and thus a timeless pairing between the franchise's titular character and his signature beast of a counterpart was born.
Two vehicles would be introduced into the range this year. The Battle Ram was a tank-like vehicle capable of firing missiles and had a front that detaches to become what would be called the Sky Sled. Of note, the Battle Ram is the vehicle for which a very well-known and highly utilized He-Man website would be named after. Finally, we have the Wind Raider. If you need a jet-propelled craft to fly alongside Stratos for aerial missions, look no further than this vehicle. Yes, it looked a little bit more like a winged boat, but it ultimately served to fly He-Man or one of his allies from point A to point B. Of course, having a centerpiece for your figures was crucial for play patterns in the 1980s, and for He-Man and his crew to do battle with Skeletor, there had to be something at stake. And thus, we have Castle Grayskull, now known as an iconic, fierce-looking structure that's very much a key focus of this franchise. Mark Ellis tells us on the Power of Grayskull documentary that this playset was partly inspired by the Guns of Navarone playset from the 1970s. You can tell that a lot of design work went into this amazing structure, and it was reworked a few times from its initial conceptual inspirations into the masterpiece we can adore even decades later. Skeletor's mission has always been to attack Castle Grayskull and obtain it in order to get a hold of its secrets, thus allowing him to conquer Eternia. In fact, the main reason he and He-Man came with two complementary halves of the Power Sword was to unlock the front drawbridge to get inside, though the toy itself can simply be opened with a latch from the back. This large, gorgeously sculpted toy serves primarily as a playset, but also has a handle at the top so that it can double as a carrying case. It's got everything from an elevator, a trapdoor activated by sliding the throne, and even comes with a training device and a slew of weapons for you to play for endless periods of time. If there's a single must-have playset in the vintage Masters of the Universe range, you're looking at it. In the various forms of media, such as the Filmation cartoon, the Sorceress is often seen as the one inhabiting and thus directly protecting Castle Grayskull from the evil forces of Skeletor. And that covers this initial first-year offering of the Masters of the Universe franchise. With everything that's been shown here, it's hard to believe that this was just the start of something more. Masters of the Universe was literally just beginning its dominance of the 1980s here and would eventually go down in history with what would be called the Big Three of the 1980s toy lines, alongside Hasbro's G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, and the Transformers. Stay tuned for some future Eternian-related adventures right here on Toy Connections, because we're nowhere near done telling this story yet. And if you enjoyed this video, don't go anywhere just yet. You can continue your Masters of the Universe history lesson by clicking on this video right over here. Or for a look at some other toy histories, you can click on this playlist right over here. Otherwise, good journey, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.